In the quiet field of the mind there is a seed that cannot be seen by ordinary eyes, yet it is more real than anything the hands can touch. It is not made of soil or water, but of awareness, patience, and restraint. When this seed is carried within the heart for 7 days, something subtle begins to shift, not in the world outside first, but in the way the world is perceived, understood, and ultimately responded to. There are those moments in life when it feels as if unseen forces are working against us. Words spoken in anger, intentions wrapped in jealousy, and actions shaped by misunderstanding may appear like enemies moving in silence. Yet the deeper truth is that much of what disturbs peace outside is already echoing within. The seed given here is not a weapon against others, but a mirror turned inward, revealing the place where conflict begins and where it can also end. To carry this seed for 7 days is to carry awareness without interruption. On the first day, one may notice how quickly the mind reacts. A small insult feels like a great wound. A delay feels like rejection. A glance feels like judgment. But instead of responding, the seed invites stillness. It asks only this: is this reaction necessary, or is it simply habit? On the second day, something softens. The urgency to strike back, to defend, to prove begins to weaken. One starts to see that not every action requires a reaction. Not every storm needs participation. In this space, silence becomes strength rather than weakness. By the third day, attention begins to turn inward more often than outward. The mind that once searched for threats now starts to observe its own patterns. Thoughts are seen as passing clouds rather than solid truths. Even the idea of enemy begins to lose its sharp edge, becoming instead a signal of unhealed misunderstanding. On the fourth day, patience begins to grow roots. Where there was once immediate judgment, there is now a pause. In that pause, wisdom quietly enters. It becomes clearer that harm often arises from ignorance, not ultimate malice. And when ignorance is seen clearly, anger has less ground to stand upon. By the fifth day, the heart begins to lighten. The need to control outcomes weakens. Life is no longer viewed as a battlefield where every moment must be won or lost. Instead, it is seen as a river, flowing according to causes already set in motion. The seed teaches acceptance not of harm, but of reality as it is. On the sixth day, something remarkable happens. The energy once spent on resentment begins to transform. It becomes restraint, it becomes clarity. And in this clarity, what once appeared as opposition begins to dissolve into ordinary human confusion, need, and fear. By the seventh day, the seed has done its quiet work. The outer world may not have changed in appearance, but its grip has loosened. What once felt like enemies plotting failure now feels like life unfolding according to countless interconnected causes. In this realization, there is no need for victory over others, because the greatest victory has already occurred within. And here lies the silent truth. When the mind ceases to feed hostility, hostility loses its fuel. When reaction is replaced with awareness, conflict loses its shape. What remains is not triumph over others, but freedom from being bound to them. To carry this seed is not to change the actions of others, but to transform the soil within which those actions are interpreted. And in that transformation, even the sharpest intentions from outside cannot easily take root. Thus, the seed is not magic. It is discipline. It is not protection from others. It is protection from one's own unconscious reactions. And in that protection, peace becomes unshakable, not because the world has changed, but because the heart has learned not to be moved so easily by it. The seed of awareness, the seed represents inner awareness, patience, and self-control, not a physical object, but a practice of mindful living that transforms perception over time. The seed of awareness is not something that can be held in the palm, nor can it be measured by the eyes. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet it carries the weight of transformation within it. When one speaks of carrying such a seed, it means carrying a continuous remembrance of oneself, not the surface identity shaped by names, roles, or opinions, but the deeper presence that simply observes. This awareness is like a quiet lamp placed in the center of a restless room. The room may be filled with movement, sound, and disturbance, yet the lamp does not argue with the shadows. It simply remains steady, revealing what is present without distortion. In daily life, the mind is often scattered across many directions. It rushes toward memories of the past and anxieties about the future, rarely resting in the simplicity of the present moment. The seed of awareness interrupts this pattern gently, not by force but by invitation. It asks one to notice what is happening right now before judgment arises. In this noticing, a space opens between experience and reaction. That space is the beginning of true freedom, because within it, one is no longer fully controlled by impulse. To carry this seed for even a short time is to begin seeing how quickly the mind builds stories. A single word from another person can become an entire narrative of insult or disrespect. A small delay can become a story of rejection. Yet awareness reveals that these are interpretations, not absolute truths. The raw moment is often simple, but the mind adds layers of meaning based on past wounds and expectations. When this is seen clearly, suffering begins to lose its authority. This seed also teaches patience, not as passive waiting but as active observation. It allows emotions to rise without being immediately acted upon. Anger may appear, but instead of becoming speech or action, it is watched. Fear may arise, but instead of turning into avoidance or aggression, it is recognized. In this way, emotions are no longer masters, they become temporary movements within a larger field of awareness. As days pass with this seed carried inwardly, something subtle begins to change. The urgency to respond to every provocation weakens. The need to defend one's identity at every moment becomes less intense. One begins to realize that not every thought deserves expression, and not every feeling requires action. In this realization, silence becomes more meaningful. It is not emptiness, but clarity. The seed of awareness also brings a quiet humility. It shows that much of what is taken personally is not truly personal. People act from their own conditioning, fears, and confusion. When this is understood, compassion naturally arises, not as an effort, but as a natural consequence of seeing clearly. Even difficult interactions begin to lose their sharpness because they are no longer interpreted through the lens of hostility. In essence, this seed is the beginning of inner seeing. It does not change the world immediately, but it changes the way the world is experienced. And when perception changes at its root, everything built upon it slowly transforms as well. Breaking automatic reactions, the speech emphasizes observing thoughts and emotions instead of reacting instantly, especially when facing insults, conflict, or perceived enemies. On the second day of carrying this seed of awareness, something subtle yet significant begins to unfold within the inner landscape. The mind, which is accustomed to reacting swiftly and without pause, starts to encounter a gentle interruption. This interruption is not forceful, nor does it demand obedience. It is more like a soft reminder that appears just before reaction takes form, a moment of quiet hesitation where choice becomes possible. In that brief space, the entire direction of experience can shift. Ordinarily, the mind moves like a river that has no banks, flowing wherever emotions and thoughts push it. A word is spoken, and instantly a response is formed. A memory is triggered, and immediately an emotional wave follows. But on this second day, the seed of awareness begins to place invisible boundaries along the river. These boundaries are not restrictions in a negative sense, but rather forms of guidance that help the current of thought recognize its own movement. Instead of being lost in reaction, there is now the possibility of witnessing reaction as it begins to arise. This witnessing is simple but profound. For example, when an uncomfortable situation appears, the usual pattern is to identify with it immediately. "This is happening to me" becomes the center of experience. But with the seed present, another perspective quietly emerges. Something is happening and it is being observed. This small shift changes everything. The experience is no longer completely personal, it becomes observable, and therefore less overwhelming. During this stage, one may notice how deeply conditioned responses are. Even minor provocations can trigger strong internal waves of anger, fear, or defensiveness. But instead of being carried away, awareness allows these waves to be seen as passing movements rather than solid truths. Anger is no longer who I am, but simply a rising energy. Fear is no longer an identity, but a temporary sensation. This distinction may seem small, but it is the foundation of inner stability. As the second day continues, the urgency to immediately correct, respond, or retaliate begins to soften. There is a growing realization that not every moment requires participation. Some situations unfold better when left untouched by reaction. This understanding does not come from suppression, but from clarity. The mind begins to see that reaction often adds fuel to situations that would otherwise dissolve naturally. In this quiet observation, patience begins to take root. Not the forced patience of restraint, but a natural patience that arises from understanding. When one sees clearly that reacting impulsively rarely leads to peace, the desire to react weakens on its own. Instead of being pulled outward by every stimulus, attention starts to turn inward, resting more frequently in awareness itself. This inward turning is not withdrawal from life, but a deeper engagement with it. Actions still happen, words are still spoken, and decisions are still made, but they are no longer driven purely by unconscious impulse. There is now a pause, however brief, where clarity can enter before movement occurs, and in that pause the quality of life begins to change. Thus, the second day of carrying this seed is not about dramatic transformation, but about the quiet beginning of interrupting old patterns just long enough for awareness to step in and gently reshape the direction of experience, transforming the concept of enemy. Through sustained awareness, the idea of enemies weakens, revealing that conflict often arises from misunderstanding, ignorance, and inner unrest rather than true external threat. By the third day of carrying this seed of awareness, the inner landscape begins to feel noticeably different, though the outer world remains unchanged. What shifts is not the events themselves, but the way they are received, interpreted, and allowed to settle within the mind. The constant rush to label experiences as good or bad starts to slow down, as if the mind is learning a new rhythm, one that values observation more than immediate conclusion. In earlier patterns, every situation demanded a response and every emotion demanded expression. But now a quiet distance begins to form between stimulus and reaction. This distance is not emptiness, it is clarity. It allows one to see that most of what disturbs the mind does not arise from the present moment alone, but from layers of past impressions, expectations, and unresolved emotions. When something unpleasant occurs, it is rarely just the event itself that creates suffering, but the meaning added to it almost instantly. On this third day, awareness begins to expose this process. A critical word from another person which might once have triggered immediate anger or sadness is now seen more slowly. First comes the sound or action, then the initial emotional ripple, and then, if awareness is present, the recognition that a story is forming around it. Instead of being fully absorbed into that story, one begins to witness its construction. This witnessing changes the entire experience. The story may still arise, but it no longer holds absolute authority. There is also a growing recognition that much of what is taken personally is not truly personal. People speak and act from their own conditioning, shaped by their fears, desires, and misunderstandings. When this is seen clearly, the sharp edge of offense begins to dull. It becomes harder to fully believe that every action is directed specifically at me. Instead, actions are seen as expressions of inner states, much like ripples reflecting the surface of unseen waters. This shift does not eliminate emotional responses, but it creates space around them. Anger may still arise, but it is no longer immediate identity. It is seen as a passing energy. Sadness may still appear, but it is not allowed to define the entire inner world. In this way, emotions begin to lose their absolute control. They become events within awareness rather than commands that dictate behavior. As the third day deepens, the mind also begins to notice its own habit of constant interpretation. It is almost never silent, it is always commenting, judging, or comparing. Awareness reveals this continuous inner narration, and for brief moments the narration slows down. In those moments there is a sense of openness where experience is simply experienced without interference. This does not mean that life becomes passive. Decisions are still made, responsibilities are still carried, and interactions still happen. But the motivation behind them begins to shift. Instead of being driven purely by reaction, actions start to come from a clearer place, less reactive, more considered. Even silence becomes meaningful, not as avoidance, but as a space where understanding can form naturally. Thus, the third day of carrying this seed is marked by a deepening of inner seeing. It is the beginning of recognizing thought as thought, emotion as emotion, and experience as something flowing through awareness rather than defining it. In this recognition, the mind starts to loosen its grip on identification, and a quieter, more spacious way of being begins to emerge. Inner change creates outer peace as patience, silence, and understanding grow within. External hostility loses its emotional impact and influence over the mind. By the fourth day of carrying this seed of awareness, something deeper begins to settle within the inner world. The earlier struggle between reaction and restraint starts to lose its intensity, not because life has become easier, but because the mind is learning a different way of relating to difficulty. What once felt like immediate conflict now begins to appear as a process that can be observed rather than instantly entered. There is a noticeable softening in the need to interpret every situation as personal. Where once the mind quickly constructed meaning who is right, who is wrong, who is friend, who is enemy, there is now a growing ability to pause before assigning labels. In that pause, experience remains raw for a moment longer, unshaped by judgment. This rawness is uncomfortable at first because the mind is used to quickly organizing reality into familiar categories, but slowly it becomes clear that this immediate labeling often creates more disturbance than clarity. On this fourth day, patience begins to transform from a practice into a natural state. It no longer feels like something forced or maintained through effort. Instead, it begins to arise on its own as a result of seeing more clearly. When one recognizes that most reactions are automatic patterns formed over years of conditioning, the urgency to follow them weakens. There is less need to correct every misunderstanding immediately, less need to respond to every provocation with equal force. In this space, silence starts to take on a new quality. It is no longer empty or passive, but alive with observation. Within silence, thoughts can be seen more clearly as they arise and dissolve. Instead of being pulled into them, awareness remains slightly apart, like a witness standing on the bank of a flowing river. The river continues its movement, but the witness is no longer swept away by it. This shift also brings a subtle change in how others are perceived. Actions that once seemed intentional or directed against oneself begin to appear more complex and less personal. It becomes easier to recognize that every person is also carrying their own inner storms, their own fears, and their own misunderstandings. From this recognition, the sharpness of resentment begins to soften. Even when harm is experienced, there is a growing understanding that it often arises from confusion rather than pure intent. The fourth day is also marked by a deepening awareness of inner space. This space is the gap between thought and reaction, between feeling and response. In earlier days, this gap was only briefly noticed, but now it begins to expand slightly. Within this expanded space, choices feel less automatic and more conscious. One is no longer entirely bound to old patterns even if they still appear. At times, the mind may attempt to return to its habitual ways of reacting strongly, especially when triggered by emotional situations. But awareness, strengthened through continuous observation, begins to recognize these patterns more quickly. Even when reaction arises, it is seen sooner, which naturally reduces its power. Thus, the fourth day of carrying this seed is not about eliminating disturbance, but about changing the relationship with it. Disturbance is no longer the enemy, it becomes material for observation. And in this shift, something important begins to form: a quiet stability that does not depend on external conditions, but on the simple act of seeing clearly without immediate interference. True protection comes from inner discipline. The ultimate message is that lasting protection is not about defeating others, but about mastering one's own reactions, thereby dissolving the fuel that sustains conflict. By the fifth day of carrying this seed of awareness, the inner movement begins to feel less like a struggle and more like a gradual unfolding. What once required effort, watching thoughts, restraining reactions, pausing before speaking, starts to happen with less force and more natural ease. It is not that disturbances have disappeared, but their ability to dominate attention has weakened. The mind, which once rushed outward to interpret and respond to every situation, begins to rest more often in a quieter center of observation. On this day, there is a deeper recognition that most of what disturbs peace is not the event itself, but the resistance to it. When something unwanted occurs, the immediate reaction is often rejection. This should not be happening. This is unfair. This is against me. Yet within awareness, it becomes clear that this resistance is what creates the heavier layer of suffering. The event is already present, already unfolding according to its own causes, but the mind adds an additional layer of struggle on top of it. When this is seen clearly, a subtle shift begins to occur. Instead of immediately resisting, there is a moment of allowing, not approval, but simple acknowledgement of what is. This allowing does not mean passivity or helplessness. Rather, it creates space for clear understanding. When the mind is not tightly clenched around resistance, it becomes more capable of seeing options, responses, and consequences with greater clarity. In this space, action, when it is needed, arises more intelligently, not from agitation but from observation. The fifth day also brings a quieter relationship with uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty may have felt threatening, as if stability depended on knowing and controlling outcomes. But now there is a growing acceptance that life is inherently fluid. Plans may shift, intentions may be misunderstood, and outcomes may differ from expectations. Instead of being seen as disruption, this fluidity begins to be understood as the natural nature of existence itself. And in this understanding, anxiety begins to loosen its grip. Attention also starts to become less scattered. Instead of constantly jumping from one thought to another, there are moments where awareness rests steadily on one experience at a time. Whether it is a sound, a sensation, or a thought, it is observed more fully before the mind moves on. This fuller observation brings a quiet richness to ordinary moments that may previously have been overlooked. Interactions with others may also begin to change subtly. There is less urgency to prove, defend, or dominate conversations. Listening becomes more present, less interrupted by internal commentary. Even disagreement feels less like a conflict and more like a difference in perception that can exist without immediate tension. By this stage, the seed of awareness has not removed challenges from life, but it has changed the way they are met. Instead of being absorbed into every wave of emotion, there is a growing sense of standing within awareness itself, where waves are seen passing rather than becoming identity. This creates a quiet stability that is not dependent on external harmony. Thus, the fifth day reflects a deepening integration. Awareness is no longer something occasionally applied, but something increasingly continuous. And in that continuity, life begins to feel less like something to fight against, and more like something to witness, understand, and move through with greater clarity.